May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Puba of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. So today we have a few more pieces from the work in progress Tassajara Stories. And we're going to get right into it just as soon as we've had our pause to meditate. So when you hit the bell from Eheiji in Japan, Eheiji Monastery, recorded in 1959 by Elsie Mitchell. When you hear that bell, and her son John, her husband John, when you hear the bell, hit pause and meditate or whatever you wish for as long as you wish, if you wish. And when you're ready to come back, just hit unpause and we'll all come back at the same time and be ready for the next piece in Tassajara Stories, the early years with Shunryu Suzuki. E.L. Hazelwood had been at Tassajara since early on. He was older, late 40s, I guess, slim, soft-spoken with a twang. E.L. said he was raised on his daddy's pea patch outside a poor, desolate West Texas town that he described in such a way as to invoke Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show, which was filmed in that area. I grew up not far from that area, but in rather affluent suburbs. But Wichita Falls was just north, and as I recall, in The Last Picture Show, they referred to Wichita Falls sort of like the big city. E.L. could be quite clear and coherent, but at times he'd get out of it, and not on drugs. E.L. was our mechanic and in charge of the shop. Overall, he did a pretty good job when he was functioning, but one day I suggested he do a more thorough checkup on our few vehicles. I was returning alone, driving the 6-ton Dodge flatbed with a truckload of horse manure from Carmel Valley for the garden. A few miles to go on the rutted dirt road, coming down a steep grade toward one of the switchbacks, the steering wheel suddenly came off in my hand, and I was holding it up in the air in front of my face. The sharp turn where the road reverses direction getting closer by the second. At least the truck was still going straight. I squeezed on the brakes hard, ready to pump if it started to slide, glancing at the drop-off on the side leading to the quickly approaching drop-off straight ahead. Not slowing down fast enough, pulled the emergency brake, pushed my foot down harder, pulled my arm up on the handbrake as hard as I could. The truck screeched up on the berm of the curb and came to a stop just as the front wheels rolled on top of it. Looking below. Made a mental note to thank the road crew for putting that sizable rise there. Walked downhill a couple of miles into Tassajara. Arriving during the afternoon work meeting outside the shop. Most residents in a circle. Went up to E.L., who was leading the work meeting, handed him the steering wheel and keys. I thought it was a great dramatic moment, but no one but he and I paid any special attention. I couldn't help but wonder if he'd done that to the wheel on purpose, or maybe half on purpose. One day E.L. said he had something to show me. Led me up the trail to the other side of the creek from the old bathhouse. Then off trail up further to a cement pyramid about 2 feet tall, placed where we had a broad view of mountains and valleys beyond. He looked at me, raised his eyebrows, smiled, then turned the pyramid over, revealing it was hollow, and below it a chamber with a crystal, a curious small polished manzanita burrow which vaguely looked like a seated figure, a tiny flying saucer, a drawing of an eye within a pyramid, some dried yucca nuts, a minuscule baby doll, and a dried leaf. He looked at me more intensely with a knowing smile. I smiled back and nodded, as if I understood something. What an interesting break in the daily routine. E.L. had gotten so crazy that he had to go to a hospital where they gave him Thorazine, a super heavy early tranquilizer. In order to continue staying at Tassajara, he'd have to keep taking it. He told me it felt to him like having cement poured in his head. He'd cheat. I recall one day seeing him caught, held down by 2 senior male students on the road, and force-fed his Thorazine by a third. That was not an agreeable solution for anyone. He became less and less functional, got to where he'd put on his robes for work meeting and wander around in his work clothes for zazen, stand on the hill above the Zendo staring down at us. Not all the time, but quite a bit. Weird behavior like that. I was at the city center and saw Claude on the steps. Said, "Claude, what are we going to do about E.L.?" He answered, funny, that's just what Suzuki Roshi was saying about you. In the staff tea one morning, not long after he'd arrived, the guest teacher, Sotan Tatsugami, asked who that person is that's standing around looking strange. He was told, "That's E.L." Tatsugami asked, what was he doing there? "Oh, just being E.L.," came the answer. They tried to explain to him that E.L. was part of our family and so forth. Tatsugami said, "This isn't a village, and that man did not belong in a monastery." So E.L. was driven to the city the next day. Snow. Standing on the hogback trail at the summit, beholding the snow-covered mountainsides, a rare snow for Tassajara. We see it above us in winter and occasional thin blankets below, but not like this, with the waterfall rushing through snow, trees decked in snow, snow at my feet a foot deep, thick snow early morning dark on the way to Zazen, snow everywhere, walking out after breakfast into the morning light, walked straight out to Grasshopper Flats, up the hogback, standing there, the air so crisp, the smell so clean and pure, the stillness, but no silence. What is that? Oh. Stood there entranced amidst a symphony of cracking, snapping, falling, landing, branches and trees from miles around, with echoes and reverberations through the white valleys. We were snowed in a good deal of the winter 1969. A few of our intrepid winter hikers found that Larry and his wife Jules, caretakers of Church Creek Ranch, had mostly run out of supplies. We got hold of the churches, who sent a helicopter, which also hopped over with some welcome supplies for Tassajara. And when the snow melted, we still couldn't drive out because the road was out in several places. The worst, a couple of miles up the road from Tassajara, a landslide which included a giant boulder that took the road crew a week to clear with dynamite. They finally got it into some smaller pieces and buried them right there in the road with the help from their backhoe and bulldozer. Till then, we'd have trucks meet on both sides of the slide to transfer goods from one to the other. Before that was possible, due to the heavy snowpack up on the ridge, we'd gone through all the brown rice, white rice, rolled oats, buckwheat, bulgur, wheat noodles, flour for bread, and we're down to eating wheat berries cooked with some brown rice found buried behind boxes in the storeroom, and when that ran out, just wheat berries. I'd bought the wheat berries on a grain run so we could make our own flour, but we found it was too time-consuming to make flour with them more than every now and then for fun, and they were too tough for normal eating, so there were a couple of giant burlap bags of them that had been sitting there. They should have been ground up into cracked wheat, but we ate them whole. Grain won't digest if you don't chew it. At least somewhat. Proof of that was seen when the truck came in to pump our septic tanks late spring. We opened them up to discover them stuffed with a massive amount of undigested wheat berries. I was sent out several times to get mail, a few supplies, and to communicate as the phone was out. I can still feel the joy I experienced when Peter would come up to me in study period before breakfast and tell me to get ready. The first trip, Dan drove me up as far as the Land Rover would go with chains and four-wheel drive. This was before the slides. Then I headed out with a heavy jacket, boots, gloves, and a large backpack containing only the outgoing mail. It was getting pretty deep when I stopped to rest in a camper stuck at China Camp and visited with a guy inside drinking brandy. He'd walked into Tassajara a few days before to let us know he was up there but was okay. There was a knock on the door. It was Loring. It's comforting running into people I know way up on that chilly, snowy mountain. He was coming in with snowshoes. He already had the mail. There was other stuff I had to get anyway. Later, we realized I should have taken the snowshoes from there, for he'd just come through a couple of miles of the worst of it. The snow got so deep in places it was a struggle to keep going. It took hours. But I didn't mind. It was so beautiful, still, clear, the air so crisp, the smell of snow transcendent. I recalled walking world religion scholar Houston Smith out one time. Later, he'd tell me what a marvelous experience that was. He'd come in during a practice period. The snow was too deep to drive, but not too deep to walk on top then, and so gorgeous. On my solo trudge in the snow, after descending a good deal, ran into Esalen Indian elder Fred Nason in his pickup where the National Forest ended, and he gave me a ride to Lambert's, where I had left my car. Went into Monterey late afternoon and did some shopping. Bought another pair of snowshoes which would help me walk on top of the snow rather than plod and even at times crawl through it. Stopped by a friend's place in Pacific Grove, got stoned, drank wine, played music, slept on the couch, got up early, and by 10 in the morning was snowshoeing back into Tassajara with as much supplies as I could stuff into the backpack. The snowshoes turned the hike from an ordeal into an inspiration. In heavy snow on the ridge, I came upon a novel sight. A couple of guys riding on top of the snow in a Jeep fitted with what seemed to be huge inner tubes for tires. Never saw that again, and I wonder why. It worked really well. The next trip, I took the Land Rover up by myself to park so I could walk back to it the next day and drive the last 3.5 miles instead of walk. I'd be pretty exhausted by the time I got to it anyway. We wouldn't normally leave a vehicle unattended up there for long because hunters, or better name, wrong people with guns, can shoot up a lone car. But unlikely anyone would get to that point, and if so, unlikely they would be the wrong people with guns. Got as far as the chains and 4-wheel drive would go, and then thought, what the heck, and hooked the cable from the front-mounted winch around a tree, pulled the vehicle up 50 feet more that way, and kept doing that for fun till I got to a place where there was only scrub brush, and they didn't hold, so it would pull them out. Those trips over the deep snow and into the unmonastic were so great. On the last one, I visited the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies, a language school, and applied for the summer intensive in Japanese. I wanted to study Japanese because it was the language of my teachers and of the country, the culture they came from. I knew that the chants were in an older classical Buddhist Japanese and Sino-Japanese, but studying the modern language would surely be a good first step to learning more about them. There was another reason I wanted to do this. I wanted a break from being at Tassajara and from running the dining room through the whole guest season. The same traits that made me a problem during the practice period made me an asset for the guests. Talkative, outgoing, indulgent, and I liked people, distractions, involvement. Most of my comrades were sincere students concentrating on their practice, limiting themselves. The main question I'd get from guests would be, why are so many people here unfriendly? I'd say they were not unfriendly, but they were tired, got up early, worked hard, and that work was part of the practice, which ideally was done in silence. The same thing happened every year. The officers would be enthusiastic about me working with the guests all summer in the spring, and then when the guest season was over, they'd say, okay, now you're going to have to straighten up and really practice in and stop fooling around. So I wanted a break from that cycle. I knew the officers would be planning for the summer guest season staffing, so I informed the director, Peter, right away that I'd only be able to run the dining room for the first 6 weeks, and then I'd be off to Monterey till the fall practice period. The immediate response I got was, "David, if you don't run the dining room for the whole summer, you'll never be able to come back to Tassajara." My response to that was, "Baloney." "Okay," he said, "I want to talk to Suzuki Roshi and the staff about this." Good try. I had to talk to Suzuki, which was fine with me. He was completely against it. I said it was too late, that it was already paid for. That was true by then. I made sure of that because I knew it would strengthen my position. I think if I hadn't watched Richard Baker closely when he related to Suzuki, I might not have had the confidence to disagree with him. Suzuki acquiesced. The memory I have of those 6 weeks in the dining room is of falling down laughing from the antics and chatter of my 2 co-workers, Alan and Craig. Alan was older, maybe 33, tall, and Craig was short. Alan had been an actor, model, was grandiose, theatrical, worldly wise, experienced, well-read, arrogant one moment and self-deprecating the next. Craig was sweet, humble, devotional to Suzuki and also to Mayor Baba, whose photo he kept posted in his room. Both of them were quick-witted. I'm usually the blabbermouth, but I was like a spectator with those two. They kept it up day after day. Now, the ideal example of when to break the silence in work practice was from Benedictine brother David, "Pass the hammer." Alan and Craig stretched that to something closer akin to practicing for vaudeville. Almost made me wish I hadn't signed up for the Japanese course. I'm sorry I can't remember one example of any of their back and forth, so I have to say, and can't show, it was funny, except, how about this? I would literally fall down laughing, completely lose it. It was good to have a couple of up students to work with. Good staffing decision. Both those guys related well with the guests. Met with Suzuki before I left. Told him I'd found a place to stay in Pacific Grove. It had a tiny living room, a tiny bedroom, and a tiny kitchen. I told him I planned to turn the living room into a combination study and Zendo, and asked if it was okay if anyone else joined me. He said to sit with Jean Ross and Carmel. Jean was in her 50s and had started sitting with Suzuki regularly from the first week he arrived in America. She was the first person he sent to Eiheiji Monastery in Japan. I said that I planned to sit with Jean every Monday night when her group meets, but I will sit every morning and evening at my place, so if someone else wants to join me, is that all right? Same answer came back. Support Jean. If someone else wants to sit, take them to Jean's. I tried several other approaches to get his blessing for a little mini Zendo open to others. No success. This time I obeyed. Barry was sleeping on the white sand in Carmel when the beach patrol woke him and told him to move on. He had just hitchhiked up from Baja California and was headed to San Francisco. Now he was walking the empty Carmel streets waiting for sunrise and a place to get something to eat before hitching up north. He went out to Highway 1, and while he was standing there waiting for a ride, he remembered that back in New York City, he'd heard a funny little Japanese man give a talk where he mentioned a Zen retreat they were raising money to buy. He realized it was somewhere near there and thought maybe religion, meditation would be the answer to my vague questing. Nothing else seems to have worked. He was lucky. First ride he got was with Catherine Thanis, a zinny on her way in there. He arrived during an interim between the second practice period and guest season. After a week, he loved being there and wrote, "The days were measured out in the chimes of bells, echoing of gongs, thwacks on a heavy oaken sounding board, booming drum cadences on a huge mounted Japanese temple drum, tops on the hollow carved wooden fish that kept the beat for chanting, clapping clappers. Sequencing events at mealtime, slaps of the stick during meditation, the slow tintinnabulation of the hand-carried good-night bell, and the faster tinkling of the rise and shine when carried by the wake-up person running through the pre-dawn darkness." Barry immediately took to the Zen meditation. About that, he wrote, "There is something undeniably transcendent and beautiful in the noble mien of a human being formally expressing with his or her stable, upright posture and respectful silence an unwavering dedication. It seems to say, here I sit, with all my sufferings and confusions and monkey mind full of desires. Here I sit with my ignorance and the harm I may have done to other beings and to my planet. Here we all sit together, submitting to the flow of consciousness in and out, with the breath, the whirligig of thoughts coming and going, letting aching tendons ache as the entire world nestles in cupped palms, reach for the sky with the crown of the head sitting until the end. Then what a blissful feeling to stand up, the mind much calmer and clearer, refreshed and even joyous, something ineffable, deep inside satisfied. We have done Zazen." He wanted to stay a long time, he said, but he was told he had to spend time in the city first. He appealed to Baker, whom he had also heard speak in New York. Baker appreciated Barry's sincerity, but told him that needing a place to stay and being afraid he'd go astray in the city weren't adequate reasons to stay. He went to the city and did fine in the supportive environment. He got a room in one of the apartments across the street from Zen Center, one of several that were full of Zen students. He drove a cab to save money for a return to Tassajara. He got into psychedelics and pot, but not so much that it interfered with the schedule at Sokoji. He returned to Tassajara for the spring practice period. At Tassajara, Barry aimed to stay as close to Suzuki as he could get. He found Suzuki wise and caring, strict yet not harsh, using his agile mind, expressive ways, and friendly sense of humor to communicate the most insightful penetration into who you really were and what life was all about. "I think you have some trouble with your mind," he told me. He told me once, typical Japanese understatement. Barry helped get the stones for the new kitchen walls. They sought ones that would fit together with a minimum of mortar. When that failed, they'd have to chip away at a stone to make it fit. And he wrote, "We'd often grunt and thrash at this task, but Suzuki, a mason who loved stones and understood their nature, could quickly size up a specimen, and with a few strategic taps on the proper seam, cleave it to perfection." The practice period ended and Barry stayed on for the guest season. He didn't want to be anywhere else, but he wasn't happy. He said he didn't have any real friends among the other students. He'd make friends with some guests, but then they'd leave, and He went off more and more on his own. Then suddenly he decided to leave. We didn't know why. He went to see Suzuki, who encouraged him to stay, but he insisted on leaving right away. Barry hiked out the next morning early, headed toward Big Sur. It took him longer than he expected. He took what he thought would be a shortcut and got tangled up in manzanita and scrub. When he emerged from it, torn and scratched, a pack of wild boar chased him up a tree, where he stayed till it was getting dark. He slept on the ground to be painfully awakened by the sting of a scorpion. At daylight he found he was on a ridge above the coast. He descended to find a cliff, doubled back, went on, descended again to find a shorter cliff, one he felt he could climb and drop from. He let his pack go first and landed next to it, relieved he hadn't broken anything, only to find a rattlesnake coiled up half under his pack. Barry went back to his native New York, where he sat with Ado at Zen studies and shared an apartment with David Stendelras, the Benedictine brother. After a few months, Ado told him that Suzuki had been ill and suggested he might want to return to California. Suzuki did have a bad flu that spring, and I know that Ado had a warm spot for him, but I'm still surprised he would send a student away. Barry got back to Tassajara during the spring interim and was assigned the job of driving the town trip truck. He went out twice a week. It was an all-day job, and a good deal of the days before and after the trip. He was glad to be back in the woods and the Zendo, but he didn't like the position which he saw as dealing with a lot of dirty laundry from the dining room and guest cabins. He was tempted sometimes to deliver the dirty laundry and drive off to Mexico with the empty truck. He wrote, despite periodic strong claustrophobic desires to flee the isolation, I hung in there trying to combat my ancient depression and come to terms with myself. The old feelings of the emptiness and meaningless and its sufferings were as strong as ever, but I tried to persevere through them and not forever be an escapist. Some people enjoy being the town tripper. It was evident Barry didn't. And when the guest manager left, he got that position. When I heard that was going to happen, I suggested, how about the garden instead? He was sincere and wanted to get along with people, but he was gloomy, depressed. But after he'd been there a week, everything seemed to be going okay, and I forgot about my reservations. This has been a Cuke audio podcast. It's got some weird background sound. Now I'm listening to it with really good earphones, so maybe you won't notice it. But anyway, I tried to deal with it. So I screwed it up. But anyway, it won't be for sale. And I'll try to figure out where that came from so it doesn't happen again. For my sake, at least. Some pieces from a work in progress, Tassajara Stories, the early years with Shunryu Suzuki. We'll hear more about Barry, and I was reading some stuff directly out of a book he wrote called Deep Fool. So until next time, this is DC, Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.